the goals for this discussion really is to just humanize people in STEM, and more importantly, I guess, bring a teacher to talk about learning when instead of algorithms or CS, which is kind of rare to see. So
Mhm.
that's the essential purpose of this, but it's really free. It's very flexible right now, and there's nothing like we have to really do.
Mhm.
To kind of bring context over here, Henry is my classmate from Flittle College before I
Mhm.
transferred,
Mhm.
and we've kept in touch since then. And he studies right now in San Jose State in
Mhm.
CS as well. And the reason we wanted to talk to you really because I think you as a teacher have really touched me.
Mhm.
As a student, I loved learning from you and seeing you being a part of your teaching staff for this quarter was also really special to see how you think about things. So I thought it would be really cool to talk to you about learning and about teaching. And that's kind of why we're here. To get started, I think we can just go on with introductions for the recording, especially. Maybe Sash, you want to start off
Sure, I can
introducing yourself?
start. So yeah, I'm I guess officially C Seshadhri. I go by Sesh. I'm a professor of computer science at UC Santa Cruz.
Awesome. I'm so happy to be in this meeting. I've been waiting all semester long because every single time Balaram tutors me, he talks about you. So I'm like, I want to meet this dude. This dude sounds so cool, especially as an aspiring CS educator. I am studying computer science and humanities. My career goal is to teach at Foothill Community College because I recognized when I first started there, the problems that exist in tech are far less demanding than the ones that I see in my classrooms, meaning to say the next smartphone is going to be, that problem's going to be solved. But when you're looking at a student who potentially is homeless, potentially, has a lot of academic trauma, that's a really, really complex problem that necessitates innovative solutions. So I'm so happy for this conversation.
Thank you. I'm Balaram. I'm a senior undergrad at UC Santa Cruz. I also study computer science, like all of you, and I do have strong aspirations to go into research and teaching in my career. Um, yeah, so maybe Henry, you want to introduce the learning code because this is kind of part of a broader initiative more than just this call, and Henry's been really driving the force over there.
Yeah. Okay. My last quarter at Foothill, which was about a year and a half ago, I came across this student success and equity grant, and I brought it to one of my favorite professors, Jeff Anderson, who has a PhD in math, and he's just student centered to a point that I didn't even know existed. My work experience is in hospitality, so a bunch of restaurants, a bunch of event planning. But what I realized is in education, the opportunity for transformative service is vastly immense compared to in hospitality. Oftentimes it's quite transactional. So Jeff really empowered me to have a broader vision of what I can do in my career and how to lead a life that I will uh, be proud to remember. So when I came across the grant, I spoke to him. He had a project called Conquering College, which is all about the explicit study skills professors assume that students should have a firm grasp of, whether it's scheduling, whether it's setting goals, creating a lecture note system, going into office hours. As we are all too familiar with, these skills are implicit in many of the assumptions, which leads to some of the catastrophes, such as the 40% dropout rate in America for college students. At San Jose State, about 85% of first-gen college students take longer than 6 years to graduate with an undergraduate. So the data proves these assumptions to be damaging. So the Learning Code is an extension of that grant. We've focused our research into the science behind how learning works. There's literally a book called How Learning Works, written by five authors. And we also centered it around another book called Creating Significant Learning Experiences by L.D. Fink. And what has been really transformational in that research is just how complex and nuanced learning can be, especially when we have these when we have to operate under some of the time frames and the constraints of in our academy. So more on the learning code a little bit later, but in essence, we are trying to develop a library that is really driven by professors and student narratives to have a broader view of what learning is and like what are the explicit practices students can use so that they realize when they're rewriting their lecture notes, it actually falls under a larger principle, which is like myelinating our synapses and the neurons firing in our brains so that when we recall them, we can have stronger concept images and mental maps. But more on that later. Balaram, maybe you want to speak to your vision of what humanizing the students and professors in STEM means.
Yeah, yeah. So it does fall under, again, the same idea that we're trying to empower students by giving them an insight into what teaching looks like, what actually learning looks like, and what is expected of learning. Because a lot of the times when you're surviving in classes, learning just becomes getting a grade. It becomes transactional, as Henry was saying. And taking that away and focusing on the material you're learning, and of course quality teaching and quality learning, I think that empowers students more, and you get more out of a course. And of course, at the same time, you'd be balancing that grade, which usually is equivalent to learning very well. So that's kind of why we're here, because to humanize teachers and students like us, teachers like you, students like us, it helps others to really understand that the system is there for them, but they have some certain steps to do for that. And as well, teachers have certain steps to make it work, because it's a very mutual relationship that exists between students and teachers in universities and colleges especially. So that's a big reason why we're here, to really expand that and bring that vision out. To get started with our discussion, we could move on to some of the points. That sounds good with all of us.
Yeah, real quick,
Yeah.
Balaram.
Mm-hmm.
If I were to do this in a more traditional way, like we wouldn't need to be recording. I would really want to get to know Professor Sesh more and just talk about this. But one of the nice parts about recording is it allows for asynchronous learning to happen, right? Very similar to the ideas of a textbook. It allows for people to enter this conversation and discourse and dialogue with less barriers to entry. Like I have a fundamental feeling if I talk to even many of the A students in our system and I ask them to define learning, I think they will have a difficult time in doing so. I think they do a lot of the practices in terms of studying and reviewing and previewing, but this allows for our larger communities in ACM at Santa Cruz, at San Jose State to begin thinking about these things. So this is really just the beginning. There's only so much we can cover, but yes, I'm happy for you to lead the discussion, Balaram.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's our first point, to talk about learning and just our definition of learning. And we wanted to start with you, Sash. What you think about learning as a professor, and as what you thought about learning as a student, and how that kind of changed once you got into teaching or later in your life. If you want to go off
Yeah,
that.
that's hard. It's interesting. I mean, so I forget that there's there's a verse from like old ancient Indian literature, and I'm probably mischaracterizing, but it said like, there are four parts to learning. So uh, I'm probably missing one, but it's something like one of them is luck, one of them is the student's effort, one of them is the teacher, and one of them just happens over time. And so I may be missing one of them in the first three, but to me, the fact that there's something that just happens over time. Sort of what this tells you is like learning is really a long-term process. And the problem with an undergraduate education is it's a small, short-term thing. So it's very hard to sort of understand learning. Even my own learning, when I was an undergrad, I was also in this phase of, okay, I take courses, I get grades, I had interests, I just kept doing stuff without a greater sense of like, where's this headed? What am I trying to learn? And I'd say it's only over the past 4 or 5 years, which has been, I graduated from my undergrad in 2003. So it's, think of it 10 years after that. So it's like almost 5 or 6 years after my PhD that now I have a better sense of, okay, these are the directions I want to learn. This is how I learn. This is what I want to do, and things like that. One of the big aspects of learning that I feel, especially I think in the context of computer science and like math, which students miss is, well, I'd say there are two aspects. So one is there's a lot of building of a huge structure. So meaning that you learn some fundamentals, then you build on those fundamentals, then you build on those and build on those. And students break it down piecemeal as, okay, this is one course, this is another course, this is another course. So I finished this course, and then the assumption is I know all of that, but you don't. You have to build on it continuously to be able to sort of internalize everything. So I think that process of internalization is something which students don't realize. And the second thing is like practice. I mean, it's like playing a musical instrument, right? I mean, you can go to the best teacher and they can tell you, these are the notes and this is how you play it. But you have to go home and every day you have to play those scales over and over and over again. And then you start internalizing it. So for example, with programming, I tell my students, if you're not coding 1 hour a day, then there's only so far that you're going to get. Like if you're doing math and if you're not solving problems every day, you know, you're not going to be able to internalize enough of it that you can start building off and go on to the next thing. And I think like this is in learning, like, you know, the process of internalizing is like one of the hardest things because it's not something that you can tell, do this and you will internalize it. So that has been, you know, one aspect of learning that I've come to appreciate more and more. But this is again something more from a pedagogical standpoint. This is less of my own learning because, you know, I've sort of gone through that process. And for example, now I don't need to teach myself programming, or I don't need to go further in programming. It's not because I'm great at programming. It's just that I have reached a particular skill level that in my career I don't need to go beyond for what I'm looking at. Where I'm trying to grow is more on the mathematical side, where of course my learning keeps continuing, right? And that there I can see myself like the process of internalizing has taken so long. So for example, even a research paper that I've written 3 years ago, like I realized that I actually don't get it. I go back and I read it again. And now I start saying, oh, so that is what's going on, right? And that process keeps happening, even with things as simple as something like, I don't know, as recently, maybe with like eigenvectors or something that you learn as an undergrad. And, you know, past 3-4 years, there's been a greater clarity of what actually all of that means. And I think that process just keeps continuing. So I don't know if this is somewhat of a rambling answer to what you had asked. So
That was really cool. I'm so glad you brought in ancient Indian literature. So luck, students' effort, the teacher, and over time, and it overall encompassing that
I'm
it's a
probably
process.
missing one of those. I'm getting one of those wrong. So that, but definitely there is the you know, it's said that there are all these parts, right? There's the student's effort, there's the teacher, and then there's time. And I
Yeah.
think the time is this internalization part. It's interesting because this quarter I was actually teaching 2 courses at different ends of the spectrum. One I was teaching 101, which Balram tutored, which is really like an upper division course, but that's really more like basic data structures. And then I was teaching computational complexity theory, which is like, you know, very different course meant for, you know, it had like less than 10 students. It was advanced material. And it was interesting to see how one has to change one's viewpoint when teaching both of those courses. Like one viewpoint that has evolved for me significantly when teaching 101. So 101 is like basic data structure. It's the incoming, it's like the basic gateway upper division course. I never used to think that I need to force students to practice something. I just said, okay, I'm going to go and I'm just going to teach you all this stuff and you'll take it up and you'll figure it out. And no, that doesn't work. So what I had to do was I come up with exercises and I said, you have to do all of these. So I'm forcing you to practice. And of course, it's overwhelming for students because like you want me to solve 10 problems in the next week, and it's like, yeah, I want you to solve 10 problems. But I think that the feedback I've got is that has helped. Whereas when I teach the complexity course, I don't do that because I assume that, you know, you're there, like you will do it because you're interested in this material. So then I teach at a different level.
Right.
And I sort of, you know, I trust the students that, okay, you know, you're going to take this forward and I'll give you a few exercises, but you will do the reading yourself.
Right.
And so it was quite interesting to sort of to teach those side by side.
Yeah, one of the really cool things that I've been reflecting on is just how privileged we are to have teachers. I know students in China and in the Philippines and some other developing countries who literally only have a textbook to go off of and maybe not even a computer. So in both of those scenarios, in those classes for you, Professor, I think what you're grappling with is how do we position students to um, do active learning, whether it's in the middle of class or right after class, and how do we help them stay accountable to that? Because at the end of the day, in my mind, what matters most in education is what happens in the brains and the lives of our students, as well as our teachers, to be honest, because ultimately that's what it's all about, right? It's not necessarily about one assessment or the outcome of a grade, but simply those metrics are there to act as guide rails. I just want to share real quick. I think Balaram has a lot of fascinating things to say about this, but to borrow some words from Susan Ambrose in her book, How Learning Works, that I'll forward, she does a pretty cool workshop on YouTube, but I'll drop the link or I'll email you the link later. But her definition of learning is that it's a process of change, changes that involve beliefs, behaviors, attitudes, and knowledge. And when I came across that line maybe 2 years ago when I was researching for that proposal for the grant, I've probably thought about that line every single day since, because I don't think there's a single day I live where those four things are not altered in some way. But the challenges, especially in STEM education, is there's a lot of change happening, and there's a lot that we are expected to learn when we are lectured to, and to manage that requires skills and habits that if we don't have a strong foundation in, it causes some misery. So yeah, so I wanted to share that definition, but Balaram, go ahead.
Yeah, I also wanted to like talk about Henry's point where he said because of the time, learning over time, it happens over time. I think that's very important because I've experienced that personally. You learn something when you go back to it and you realize that you've actually understood something and it makes sense in this other place, and that's how you kind of connect the dots. Um, I wanted to hear about maybe your personal experience with learning over time, especially from your undergrad education. If there was anything particular that you absolutely did not like, you didn't like it as much, or you thought like you only survived the course, you didn't really learn through the course, but later on in your life, you went back to it or it came back to you. If there's any situation like that you had.
Um, so, I mean, as an undergrad, I well, actually, this is one that I still haven't come to terms with. It is operating systems. I was never good at it. I always got bad grades in it, and it has stayed with me throughout my life. And at that point, I knew that, like, to some extent, this is not my future. Um, but with a lot of like the math courses and the understanding, that has certainly changed. So interestingly, like the computational complexity course that I taught, I did that course as an undergrad. Not entirely the same material, but give or take. And I enjoyed the course, but I didn't internalize much of it because it's a lot. And it's so funny that now when I go back and look at it, like a lot of it makes much more sense, right? But it's since how long it takes time to sort of absorb all of these arguments and how they build off each other. And and I've also noticed that interestingly, like when I read the textbook, a lot of it just like immediately makes sense. It just sort of flows like, yeah, okay, this, yeah, this. Because essentially what I'm able to do is this process of abstraction, right? There's a long, complicated argument, but I've broken it down to like, oh, that's that kind of argument. This is this kind of argument. This is this kind of argument. So there are only three ideas here that I need to know, and then I know what's going on. And of course, the first time you do it, when you encounter it, you just see this like huge spread of like 2 pages of math, and you're like, what on earth is going on here? And you're trying to go line by line and figure out what's going on. And I think what happens over time is this process of abstraction, right? You start recognizing this is the key idea here. It's like when you look at code, right? At the very beginning, you look at code line by line, and you're like, I have no idea what's going on. But then at some point, you get this like, this is a module that does this, and this is a module that does this. So you get that process. Um, and I guess the hard question: how do you get there, right? How do you go from going line by line to getting the abstraction? And I guess there's some part of it that's a mystery. But I think the thing is, I guess repeatedly doing it over and over again, repeated practice really starts, and seeing it over and over again really helps in getting that sense. But once you make that switch, it's hard for you to imagine what it was like before that.
Yeah, yeah. And you talk about practice a lot and how students should practice in order to internalize material. But as a teacher, are there methods like that's as an instructor you can enforce practice, but as a teacher, do you have methods that will help students internalize when um, you're physically teaching the material? Um, and do you have methods that students can actually take advantage of that and take the opportunity over there that's provided to really internalize in lecture specifically?
In lecture, that's a um,
I notice you doing it, Professor, in some of your recorded lectures. When you ask questions, right? You give that you invest that little bit of time for them to catch up to what you just said,
right.
right?
So that is one of the things I was sort of thinking, like, I drop questions in class and say that, okay, pause and give me the answer. And that's a chance for the student to reflect, like, do I really get what's going on? I will confess that one of the not the it's very hard. It's challenging to come up with those questions, because I have to come up with questions that have multiple choice answers that are sort of will reflect one little concept. I actually came up with this idea. I mean, it's not my idea. I was reading about active learning, and I watched. I think Eric Mazur there's this talk that he gave about active learning and about like peer instruction, and that's when I really started thinking about it. That it should not just me going on lecturing, but I would like to come up with those things for like computational complexity, but I don't, because it takes too much effort. Like I should probably do that, but when I teach a more advanced course, I just lecture. Although it would be good to come up with questions and say, okay, wait, reflect on this. What is the answer? But in terms of what is a good way of practice, I think one of the roles of a teacher in practice is almost like just coming up with a good set of problems, which I feel if you practice, you will learn. Like, if a student tries to go about practicing, they might be practicing things that might not be getting them the necessary skill set to learn a bunch of things. Maybe to give an example, um, and this was something that came up in one. Suppose I wanted to teach students linked lists. I want you to really get linked lists well. And I had sort of thought about this, like, what is the way in which I can test students' understanding of linked lists? And so what I've come up with, and is basically there are lots of these like interview style problems on linked lists, like reverse a linked list, or delete the last element, deduplicate, like lots of these. And I think like if you do a whole set of such questions only on linked lists, then you get it. You get linked lists. And then once you do that, then you move on to the next data structure. And these things is not rocket science. You Google, and then there are lots of like Geeks for Geeks or whatever, all these websites that have all these problems, which are excellent problems. But I don't think it's in many students' horizon that I need to do that. Some of them do, but for many of them, especially I think like those who are first gen, or those who don't come from a background where they have knowledgeable people around them who can give them this advice, they're not, because no course is going to tell you go and do these 10 problems. And a student might think, I don't need to do those 10 problems, I need to do the homeworks. But in some sense, I don't think the homeworks necessarily help you internalize as much as a lot of small exercises on the same thing. You do all of those and then you move on to the next thing. I don't know if that something like that. Like, so this is sort of what I've been increasingly converging towards in one-on-one, which is coming up with like lots of little problems that you solve. And then once you solve those, then you can try to do something bigger. And then having that, for like every like different data structures or different concepts to then sort of cover that. So that yeah, I mean, also because I feel that a lot of the material that is taught in 101, I keep referring to 101, but essentially like basic data structures and algorithms is something that is so foundational to being a computer scientist. Like, unless you really get that stuff, unless you understand fundamentally how a data structure works, what is the meaning of running time? At the level at which, you understand it both at a higher level description and you understand at the level of coding it up. I think at that point you actually have enough to now go and be productive in industry at the very least. And then that would then be the basis for any further education. And I think one of the problems we face is we push students through that as quick as possible, right? It's like, oh, do this course, then do the next one. And then now you're upper division and go ahead and do all the fancy stuff. But I think unless that part is really internalized well enough, it's a problem. And often the students who are successful, I've noticed, are the ones who already have some background in them. So they've done some of the internalization already. And then they come to my course and then they completely internalize it. And then they're just like, now they know what to do. But for the others, it's really like, even at the end of my course, or I'm just my course or what, the course, they need to go back and revisit that material a few times until they really have that done.
I so appreciate your response. I do want to be really respectful of your time.
Yes,
I think
of course.
Balaram mentioned that, I don't know how much more time you have, but this was scheduled only till 2, right?
So I have time until until a kid drops in. Yeah.
I'll comment.
That was a long answer. So go ahead and,
That was a beautiful answer. I hope at some point I'll teach Balram how to clip up some of these meetings to be more digestible, succinct clips for other people to engage with in ACM or other STEM students in CS department. But the comment I wanted to make is, well, there's actually two. One is that there's a policy thing there, right? Which is, you mentioned how difficult it is to generate questions for your complexity class. And that gets to the fundamental difference between teaching and course development. Like, as similar as those things are, they are actually not similar. Like, as soon as you have 100 students on your roster, your goose is cooked in terms of like developing out the course and thinking about new assignments and deliberate practice and active learning. Like, literally your goose is cooked. So at someday, I hope to get the ratio for students to teachers closer to 1-to-1. But from now until utopia, let's continue brainstorming. The other comment I wanted to make is, I guess, just maybe some gratitude that you have that equity lens as a CS professor, because what you were reflecting on is the fact that at the beginning of every term, you have some students who run a 5-minute mile and some students who run a 10-minute mile. And if we were to define learning as a process of change, it very well could be that the 10-minute mile runner worked double as hard, spent 2 times the amount of time, but the result of the grade with the metrics that we're measuring learning is not actually an accurate representation of that change, of that process. And ultimately, it is way harder to measure the process of learning than the assessments that we have. But I hear you making an active effort in that. So I just wanted to appreciate you.
No, this is really a big issue. And this is something that it is, I started teaching 5 years ago. So I didn't have this hat on when I joined, because you don't have the perspective. Also, one of the problems is, if you think about it, most people who become professors are star students. So their experience of learning is very different from the others. Like not to boast, but the truth of the matter is, like, I was a really good student. I could pick stuff up, and I had all the background, I had the family back, I had everything set up for me. And so I go in saying that, okay, I'm going to teach students all of this really advanced, cool material. Like, that's what I want to do. But it's taken some years to realize that, but that's not what the students need. And there are some students who are there, but not everybody. And I think you're absolutely right. This issue of, like, I was also thinking about really in terms of running when I was describing to someone. I was like, some people, I was thinking more like a marathon. You want to train people to run a marathon. Some people already can run 5 miles. And there are some people who can barely run around the track. And what we're saying is, at the end of 3 months, everybody needs to run a marathon. And that just doesn't make any sense. This is, I was having a discussion with some other faculty members about this very point a few hours ago. And one is do we need to, identify students and give them extra training before they take this course? What is it that, because that would be one way of trying to address this. But the truth is, in the end, the work burden is going to be higher on the student who is less prepared, and that inequity, that imbalance is going to be there. Now, how do we spread that out, and how do we deal with that in a way that we're not burdening the student even more? That's a hard one. Like, I don't have a good answer to that. Um, yeah.
Yeah, this is just the beginning. I have a lot to say about that, and I've been working on this for 2 years. And Jeff, my mentor at Foothill, he's been thinking about that problem for like 10 years now. So I have a lot to share in terms of what he's published and what he's trying to get closer to that. But ultimately, I would say the 10-year long vision is to build out a curriculum and to get a book published, so that not because a book is ultimately going to change the students' lives, but just to be able to point the finger and really critique some of the deficiencies in how we're going about this, because there is no reason that a college readiness course does one PowerPoint presentation on study skills and one workshop on time management, and then we say good luck, because that leads to the outcomes in which we're seeing, especially in STEM, where the pressure not only from admin but from industry is like, you better prepare these students to know all these, right? But as soon as the COR gives you 10 different concepts when they only give you time to really teach 5 thoroughly, ultimately the person who suffers the most are the students in that scenario. So I have a lot to say about that, but I think Balar also has something to say.
No, actually, I don't have anything to say about. I think I found that really special as well when I was on your teaching staff for this course, that you took that into mind very explicitly. Whereas normally professors, either they take it into mind behind the scenes and no one really knows about it, or they actually talk about it and they address it very publicly, which I think is the best way to go about it, just to be open about it and to be almost, because I personally, I consider myself from a privileged background as one of those people who have it all set up for them. So I don't have any personal experience of this, but I do know students, especially from community college, who have found it difficult to get up to speed with courses and learning because of just how hard it is to find time and just to find confidence that they can do it. And it was really special to see, especially that first class you had with 101. I remember watching the recording and you had like a full day. It was syllabus day, but it wasn't just syllabus day. It was a lot more than that. And yeah, so that was really special to see. And I'm thankful for that there are professors like you who take that into consideration.
Yeah, and
And
I think you're right about it being open, right? One has to tell students, like, you know, this is what is required of a CS degree. Not to scare them away, not to say that, oh, you can't do this, but to say that, look, let's lay it out. Like, this is the kind of effort that you need to put in so that you will see the reward. And I think if we're not open about that, then it's being unfair to the student, because they go into this degree not knowing what they get, and maybe they're not successful for reasons that they're not very sure about. Yeah, this is something that I've been struggling with a lot. My ideal is to really do the following: is to say that the quarter you join, I even said that, like, I even proposed it. I want to teach students basic logic, starting from Boolean algebra. Like, what does it mean for a statement to be true? What does it mean for it to be false? What does it mean? Like, just get your groundings and logic really set up, and then lots of other things start following naturally. Like, this ability to basically convert ideas into logic. Those of us who can program easily, we're just doing that really quickly. We don't realize that we're going through that phase, like, oh, if else this not, we just do it. But I think that, and that shows that we've been trained well. But for many students who don't have the right high school background, I think, like, that part of that piece of development is missing, because all their mathematical training is symbol pushing. Oh, d by dx of sine x is cos x, d by dx of cos x is minus n. Like, just remembering all these formulas. That's what they think math is. And what they really need to know is, like, what does it mean for an if statement to be true? What is the converse of a statement? Like, how do you represent some statement mathematically? What is a set? Like these sorts of basic concepts, when you're taught properly and it becomes like really you internalize it, then I think a lot of the, at least in computer science, a lot of the learning then becomes easy. We technically do have this as part of a discrete math curriculum, but it's one piece of a lot of other things. The discrete math curriculum comes at some point, and I want to like pick students as soon as you join and say, stop. Ignore all the math that you've learned. Let's go back to what you knew in middle school, and we'll start from there and teach you logic. In the ideal world, like that will be a course, but we'll see.
I remember that was actually my discrete math. I had a professor. He had the famous statement, "If you wash my car, you'll get an A." And we just manipulated that statement all over. And that's how we kind of learned, as you were saying, logic, true, false statements, if statements, the converse, contrapositive, what that means. And when you bring out, when you have a teacher who's really ready to do that for you, this was Patrick Morris from Foothill College. And I think that actually set my foundation in computer science, because I took that course just before transferring, and I thought it was a great course. It got me interested in graph theory and all that. But when I came to an algorithms course and I started taking theoretical courses here, just that understanding of what a proof means, what logic means, and why things follow from each other, I think that's really interesting. And I think even Stephen Wolfram in the podcast he had on meta mathematics was just talking about like understanding a proof one from another. Like you can go all the way deep into the details, like, or you can be really abstract about it, but it's the same connection you got to make, because it's like yeah. So I think, and it all comes from a logical background and good reasoning and logic and math to understand what you're doing in computer science. So I completely relate with what you said over there.
That's so cool. Both of you have that vision. I think there's reasons why traditions go unexamined. And Balaram, how young is Balaram to be thinking about these things, right, as he's preparing to ramp up? But I would love to keep that conversation going on how we can get that course to be potentially an open access course. Maybe we can apply for a grant to get funding to develop out that course. Like that is for sure a problem. And what's really actually, I would say, why that problem is a mission critical problem, just like how if we don't treat teaching and learning as an actual science, is ultimately that's how our bridges don't collapse, right? Our bridges don't collapse. The reason our bridges don't collapse is not because we trained and churned out a bunch of students who know the derivative of sine. The reason they don't collapse, and the reason why our phones can be fairly affordable for people and citizens in third world countries, is because we were able to think critically and dig deeper and challenge the status quo. But what I am seeing now, the vast majority of students, even for the ones who do end up graduating, are not primed for this deeper level of thought. And to say that they'll figure it out in industry, I think is a dangerous assumption.
I agree. All right, I'm gonna have to leave in a couple minutes. There are yelling noises coming from outside my door.
Yeah, whenever you're
I think this is a
ready
good
to
time.
leave,
I think
you can, yeah,
this is a perfect time.
good.
Well, I would love to, yeah, let's maybe follow up on the next conversation. And Balaram and I both have this vision, which is this is just the beginning of a series where we can really humanize other professors in STEM and other students to get a much larger and robust conversation than the one on Rate My Professor and Reddit.
Certainly. I think there's a lot of value to that, so that we understand learning not from this sort of mechanized perspective, and I take courses and I get a grade, or I do a homework and I get, but rather that there is this concept of learning, which is really hard to define, but is really the goal.
Yeah, and there are hierarchies in place that prefer the former, but I think from grassroots movements, from dialogue and discourse, we can move the needle gradually. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Yeah, welcome. I hope this is of use. Good talking to you.
Yeah, what a pleasure. Next semester, I'm going to be an SI, supplemental instructor for data structures and algorithms. So be sure that I will be going through every single one of the videos that you have so kindly provided on your YouTube. And the day you get 10,000 subscribers, I hope to contribute to that push.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Have a good day.